Everyone, thank you for joining us today on this exciting event that we're having to celebrate our Key Futures pilot program. We're going to be chatting with one of our coaches. The Key Coaches program is one of the three components of Key Futures, and coaches are here to mentor and facilitate who we have as key champions to help them achieve their sustainability goals. So we are very excited to have Douglas Worts with us, who is based in Canada, who's going to be sharing with us his insights and perspectives on what sustainability can mean for the cultural sector. So thank you very much, Douglas, for being here with us. I would like to start by asking you to introduce yourself, a little bit of who you are and what's your experience in the field.
All right, yeah, well, my name is Douglas Worts, and I live in Toronto, Canada, and I'm a semi-retired museologist. I've been working in the field museums since the mid-70s, and went through a graduate training program in museology back in the very early 80s, and then launched my career largely at the Art Gallery of Ontario, which is a large art museum in Toronto. And I spent 25 years there as an educator, interpretive planner, audience researcher. And I, throughout that time, I continued to do teaching at the graduate level, particularly in museum education, but also in sort of progressive issues related to the museum field. And I left the Art Gallery of Ontario in 2008, and I started a small little consultancy that was really focused on culture and sustainability, and the role of potential role of museums, and the name of that is Worldviews Consulting.
Great, that's amazing. Thank you. I was wondering what was, you had like a kind of a, not a career change, but you were shifting a little bit towards museums, you said. So what was that pivotal moment when you realized that you wanted to shift and to work with sustainability?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I would say that there were many pivot points along the way that were all relevant, because my early work in museums really took me into many amazing places, and my early days in education really laid the foundation for my work in culture and sustainability, and certainly being an educator, but also becoming an interpretive planner at the museum led me into some fascinating places. And I learned early on that as an educator, really you're talking about relationship. You have to do learning as a two-way street within relationships, and so it wasn't a moving knowledge from here to here. It was really cultivating knowledge and awareness, and that happens through relationships. And I saw enormous opportunities in museums to be able to do that. But it's where I also began to focus on the whole business of relevancy for museums, and these are foundation points, I would say, dealing with sustainability work. But at that point, that was not in my, what I was thinking about. But it was really when I started getting involved in experimental exhibits, and I realized that I had a whole lot of different tools and strategies I could use. But ultimately, I had to figure out, what did relevancy and success and impact look like for individuals? And that led me into the whole world of audience research. And in art museums, especially in the 80s, audience research was not well established at all. It was pretty new in the field. There had been historically some audience research initiatives in the past, but the more modern museum from mid-century on really did not use audience research, and I became involved in with a group of people in the United States and ultimately it led to the forming of the Visitor Studies Association, of which I was one of the founding members. So that's how important it became to me, and I realized that I needed to be building these incredible feedback loops. If I was trying to engage with people, I needed to know what was happening. What could I learn from what they were learning, and how then would that feed into what I had to offer in that evolving relationship. So that was pretty important. And at one point, I started working on how people interacted with artworks, but I became, most museums tend to focus more on the historical contexts and artistic intent, all of which are fascinating dimensions of art. But I became really kind of mesmerized by the potential of artwork to stimulate the creativity of individuals, largely through their personal imagination. And I developed a number of techniques for doing that, and using audience research as an integrated part to really understand more about what was going on. And it opened an incredible door. And eventually I got to the point where I have really come to believe that the biggest single contribution that art has to make is to generate new creativity. And it becomes a catalyst. It comes out of creativity, but then it gives birth to new creativity. And I thought, wow, that's pretty amazing. And but it was, in many ways, it ran into some of the power dynamics of museums, where knowledge is power, and that's built into the hierarchies of museums. And so I was looking at all this fascinating stuff that was happening with individuals interacting with artworks, and not to take anything away from what the disciplines actually have to say and how they illuminate the past and the present and artwork. But I came to believe that it wasn't an either or kind of proposition. It was an and it needed to be woven in, because this is a co-creative process, and it's one that is continuously being reinvented. And that work happened to coincide in 1997 with me being invited to join an organization called Leadership for Environment and Development. And LEAD was created by the Rockefeller Foundation in the United States, and their goal was to build a global cross-disciplinary network of mid-career professionals committed to the idea of creating a sustainable world. And so I couldn't have been more fortunate. And most of the people in the program were lawyers and doctors and engineers and scientists and economists and business leaders and political leaders. And there I was, a museum educator. And so I felt very intimidated, but it didn't take long for me to realize that my approach to this was that, yes, we're going to need new economic frameworks and engineering and new technologies, and we're going to need all of that kind of innovation. But if there isn't a shift at the cultural level, there would be no sustainability. And I still believe that that's true. And what I saw in museums was an unbelievable global network of organizations with talented, creative people inside, with connections to the arts, to science, to history, to just about every discipline, that had the potential to kind of redesign itself to become more oriented towards having impacts on the living culture, as opposed to what is largely the case of operating educational and entertainment operations within the leisure time economy. And so it was an incredible thing to suddenly be. I had 2 years of training with all of these amazing colleagues, both across Canada and with colleagues around the world in my cohort. And I've been involved with LEAD ever since. I'm on the board of LEAD Canada, and it was that was a pivotal point. But I would argue that there were many pivotal points along the way, including since then.
It's very interesting because you had said, I read in an interview, you said that museums can dictate cultural change, but they may be able to catalyze it. And I think that's very interesting because what you're saying is that museums can have the role to educate people, but without the exchange and the openness of just to impart knowledge, but also to receive knowledge from outside, and not only also from the art world or from the cultural sector, but from everywhere. Like that's the way in which you can contribute to change, right? In a way, I think. Do you see this? I mean, I think that there's been a change. It's also very interesting for me that you are a museum educator. Like the title itself, it says a lot. But we are shifting. Do you think that we are close to having that important break where museums can truly open themselves as not just as providing education, not just as receiving feedback from the audience, but having a dialogue?
I think that there's a long way to go still, but in 25 years, I have seen very little movement in museums until recently. And there has been a really an important surge in interest around these kinds of possibilities. But I think it will take experimentation to get people interested, because much of the training for museums is still very much located in the disciplines, and even the discipline of museum studies is still largely organized around the traditional structures and hierarchies, because museums can be very hierarchical. And the other thing is that they've been created within a corporate environment that narrows a lot of what it is that they do, and it has been located within the leisure time economy. It's seen as a driver of things like tourism, and tourism is a very questionable place to hitch your wagon to these days, because there are just so many forces that are saying that tourism is not coming back anytime soon, and if it does, it's going to come with a giant carbon footprint that is not going to be good for anybody in the longer term. And part of what I think needs to happen too is museums have often seen themselves focused on transactions. It's when people come to museum sites and there is a transaction. There's often exchange of money, and somebody gets an experience and they go away. It's not really built on relationship building, and it often is geared towards collections or areas of interest as defined by the corporation. And I think that the surge in interest that has really become evident as museum people around the world are becoming quite vocal about the need to address particularly energy issues and carbon issues and climate change, but there are many issues. That is a new kind of orientation, less focused on the disciplines, which are kind of internal resources, and more examining the trends that are happening in the world around us. And if we are going to be catalytic, we have to understand the nature of systems dynamics. And again, that's not a standard part of museological training. I mean, we barely have an audience research function built into the operations of museums. So I think that there's a lot that needs to be done. But as you move closer, as more and more people are moving towards this and insisting that no, we have to be able to have impact on the things that are vital to our well-being, both now and in the future, we get closer to a tipping point of our own that can start to see, and I think the government funding will begin to shift away from being sort of leisure time oriented and more into the building of resilience within the living culture. And I think that's a very positive vision, and one that we need to cultivate. But it's out there. It's out there, and I think key culture is going to tune into that too.
Well, we certainly hope so, and all our energies are there. So you already explained this a little bit, but can you go a little bit further about what do you think is culture's role in sustainability, or what are the potentials of culture and sustainability?
Well, I think its potential is to become a catalyst, and there needs to be a lot of discussion about what that means. Even if we think within rather traditional terms about museums as visitors and all of that, if you're trying to be catalytic about things, you're trying to create an environment in which you're inviting the creativity and the motivation of people who are coming in to blossom and to. But if you get beyond the individual and you start looking at neighborhoods or communities, and how do you address the needs of communities, and realizing that you have all kinds of tools in your toolkit, essentially, whether it's the arts and working with artists and creativity, or working with science. And I think science and art are actually two sides of the same coin, but they look very differently often. And also the role of history and the importance of what has happened now in the world in terms of becoming a global community. And although we don't see the globe except through mediated experiences and technology on a daily basis, we know now that we're part of a global reality. So as we try and do things locally, we need to be keeping in mind how this actually relates to what's happening globally. And in some ways, the pandemic has been a really interesting example of that. Still, there's an awful lot of inequity that is out there, and it's systemic, and it's built into structures. And one of the greatest challenges, I think, is going to be figuring out how to change systems that were not designed to be transformed. They were designed to be persistent. But museums, as they're beginning to look at this, I think that they need to understand what it looks like at the individual level, and also look at what it means at the community level, and probably at the bioregional level. And just given what we know about the problems associated with flying food all around the world, and the cost in carbon and things like that of doing that, and the inequities that come with it. We need to be thinking bigger, and it's a humble place to be. That's another kind of interesting distinction, because I think a lot of times disciplines are a place where you turn to expertise, where there is a great deal of power and insight and all of that. But we're looking at the kinds of wicked problems that are not going to be solved by that. We need to be creative, and we need to be transformative in new kinds of ways. So I think that parts of museums are thinking about those things, but the structures are not necessarily designed around that. But there are interesting and really important initiatives, particularly related to the restoring relationship with indigenous communities around the world. Reconciliation is important, really vital to any kind of sense of a future, and equity is just a non-negotiable thing. And so it's not just a matter of trying to repopulate museum staffs with diversity. That's going to be necessary, but insufficient. We need to find ways to be catalytic at creating those kinds of changes at the community level. All of which is, I think, part of the role that culture plays in creating sustainability. Now, the exact engineering and re-engineering of museums to do that is an evolving story, and I think it will be. All of the champions that are joining in on Key Futures are already looking at implementing new kinds of activities for them, and having them engaged in those processes and taking account of the impacts that they create in their communities is really that's really exciting, and it will lead to lots more inspiration and lots more change.
And what is the thing that you are most looking forward to in the Key Futures pilot?
Well, I would say I'm already really excited by the people I'm meeting who have joined in to the pilot, and they are people who understand that the world is in a state, and it has motivated organizations to begin to shift. So I'm really looking forward to learning from them the kinds of innovative things that will happen and can happen in and with their own communities. And if I can lend a hand at helping to guide that, then that would be great. But I'm really excited about the creativity that's coming out of the people who are signing up to be part of the Key Futures program. And I think too, there is a co-creative process, just making, migrating the idea of museums as the deliverers of services to the idea of co-creating meaning and co-creating action. I think is exciting, and I've taken much inspiration in my career from some of my colleagues working in eco-museums in different parts of the world. And for those who aren't familiar with eco-museums, they were started in France in the late 60s, but as their focus is on the well-being of a region. And it's engaging the people of the region in creating that well-being and using their own creativity to do things. Now, in some instances, that has turned into a community museum that has lost its connection to the vital emerging identity. But in all cases, the eco-museums are really concerned with maintaining a vital tie with an ethical approach to operating and connecting to the past and building on the strengths and the insights that come from the past. So there are organizations out there that I hope are going to become more woven in eco-museums aren't necessarily all that woven in, especially in North America, into the mainstream of museums. And I think there's exciting possibilities associated with that. So these are some of the things that I'm excited about.
That's great, amazing. And what does sustainability look like in your professional life?
Well, sustainability, I think, is at its core is moving into a systems orientation. It's looking at big systems, and I think that the Enlightenment that happened, some centuries ago, really resulted in a focus on the rational and how to use the rational as a way to build. And it's been an incredibly powerful strategy for constructing all kinds of things, but it's created some big blind spots. And I think that we're going to find our way into a place where we need to be looking at the big systems and seeing how, first of all, looking at them and truly understanding what is happening. And there's more than enough data about what's happening in terms of the degradation of environmental systems, but also in the perpetuation of inequity. At the same time, the UN has made some progress on in collaboration with countries around the world in eliminating some of the worst levels of poverty and things like that. But we still have such big systemic problems. So for me, sustainability is making that shift from being, we're going to create an exhibit about A or B to this is the big problem that's out there, and how are we going to engage people in it, and where do we find the resources, and how do we build the partnerships, and how do we do the co-creation, so that we begin to make shifts at the cultural level. But even that question about what does it mean to have cultural impacts, and how would you measure them? And these are big questions that I think we all have to sit with, and they aren't straightforward. And it's going to take us into territory that we're not all that comfortable with. And one of the places that I've found the greatest kind of stimulation is really with looking at large-scale economic systems, because they do provide the motivation for so much of what the human reality is, but its success is actually tied to consumption, to power, to accumulating power through money, and it's by looking at the kinds of brilliant thinking that is happening with, for example, Kate Raworth, the UK economist who's created the idea of donut economics, which is an economic system that actually is true to the origins of the word economics, which is care of the household. And so economics was never designed to be something revolved around money. Economics is really fundamentally about how value is moved between people and around the globe. And how do you do that with equity and with well-being as the bottom lines? Because right now, our economic system is actually the driver of pretty much everything that is destroying the natural environment. And so until we get to a point where museum people are thinking about culture in longer terms and more systemic terms, of how do you find the leverage points where you can do something that can engage people, motivate people, that creates then cascading change. It's a beautiful and wonderful sort of way to think differently about this. And I'm looking forward to working with some of those really bright economists that are out there. And they're They're in many, many places in the world, and they come out of largely ecological economics, and that field has been around for a long time too, but very marginal. But it's moving into center stage, I would say.
Think you were talking about systems and structural systems. Do you think that culture needs its own systems, or we can borrow from these ideas that are already out there, creating and catalyzing change and adapt them for the cultural sector?
This is a very interesting question about whether culture needs its own systems. It's a little bit about similar to, is culture one of the pillars of, along with economics and nature and society, is culture a pillar? And I think that culture is a foundation. And it's a changing foundation. And one of the problems with the systems as we have institutionalized them is that they become very self-referential. And whenever you create corporations, they tend to get created to do certain things. And but if the environment shifts and changes, and the requirement is really for something different, then corporations don't have that easy time because of how corporate structures and power. I mean, this is a conversation that I think that we need to have across cultures. How do you make sure that it's wisdom that is guiding society and not power, and that and how do you build that connection between wisdom and expertise? These will be big questions along the way. So I'm not sure, but I think of it less as a sectoral system. So because it already is in a largely leisure time, it exists mostly in a leisure time market. Yes, there's an academic kind of connection with some museums anyway, to universities and things like that. But largely it's driven by how it engages the public, and it's almost always in leisure time. And I think that's got to change, because if we think about how the systems across the culture need to change, different decisions need to be made at different places at different times. And so if your only offering is on-site or online, through these structured programs looking at leisure time, then it's going to be a challenge. But can museums imagine themselves being partners out there with different parts of the society, and they need to see themselves as catalysts, not deliverers of services. And I think that's different. But exactly what that looks like, I think, requires lots of experimentation. And so I would say we should not go rushing to create new systems. We should try and be able to push outside the boundaries of our existing systems far enough to really get some insights into what does meaningful cultural impact look like. And then at some point we may say, oh, okay, well, we need a different kind of system. But at this point, I don't think there's any clarity about that. But we definitely need to break out of our existing system.
Yes, and this is also something that I think that we could discuss for a very long time, because as you said, there's still like a long way to go. But unfortunately, we cannot discuss about this for hours. So the last thing that I would like to ask you is if you can name or think about one initiative that really caught your attention or you thought it was interesting recently taken by a museum, a cultural institution, something that you thought, this is a good uh, or it can have an impact in the future.
Well, one that I was asked this question recently, and the answer I came up with I think might work here. It's not in a classic museum, but it's in an aquarium, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and aquaria are really interesting organizations. They've had a long history, but Monterey Bay is one of the ones that distinguishes itself. And I think there are others. I'm not in that world, so I don't know. But they're obviously very concerned with the well-being of coastline and ocean habitat and life in the sea. And probably a decade ago, they decided that they were going to. They looked around, and I think they could see that what was at threat here, the well-being of the of life in the sea, really was being determined by things like the marketplace for fish, whether it's people buying fish or through a market, just going to a market, or whether it's restaurants, wholesalers, even the fishing trades. They would go out and they would fish, and so, but by the museum taking data that it was already collecting on fish stocks, the well-being of fish, the sizes of the populations, etc., they were able to make determinations about where were the places that you could go, or the fish stocks that you could actually consume and without damaging the whole system. And so they developed a network to exist far outside the museum, in fact, all up and down the west coast of the United States. And they provided all kinds of information to people at the points at which they needed to make decisions. So you could actually log on to the internet on your phone and you could find out, should I be looking at such and such a fish type in the market for buying it, or should I better be looking at this type because this is where the unsustainability is, and this is where the sustainability is. And that actually was a way of building connection to a vast number of people that had huge impacts on action. And I think it's those kinds of things that we need to be looking at as to how to encourage individuals and organizations to make different kinds of decisions. And I do think that's an exemplary practice that Monterey Bay has created.
Great, thank you. It's an amazing example of also how culture needs to interact outside of its own field, right? Like go
Yes.
further into other systems, into getting the information, but also repurposing that information. That's really also very important to create awareness, I think.
That's right. And so, and if it's not just getting all the way out there to those people, it's building a network of partners. And because there are all these organizations, there's never in the history of humanity been more individuals and organizations working on how to build a sustainable future. How do museums actually connect with those partners to expand the way in which this work operates? And I do think of three fundamental functions that need to be encouraged through the museum by activating the muses. And that is encouraging deep reflection. So that is getting people to think about what is going on out there, how am I connected to that, and what am I going to do in relationship to that? The second piece is dialogue, and it's actually talking to others about how they see those same trends that are going on around us, and the insights that they might have, and how do you build cohesion, how do you build common vision. And the third one is co-creative action, and how do you then, based on the relationship and the cohesion you've been building along the way, develop co-creative processes to actually change the things that you know need to change, and to solidify the things that need to be solidified. And I think those are important questions for the museum field to be thinking about and collaborating on. And it's an exciting time.
It really is. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking with you, having this conversation. I'm really looking forward to see what will come out from our Key Futures pilot and all the exciting things that you will share with us, but also everything that we